She had built a fortress of secrets to protect her family, brick by painful brick, lie by careful lie. She believed the high walls and the deep moat would keep them all safe, that the story she controlled was the only one that mattered. What Margaret Grace Ives never imagined in all her years of careful construction was that the very fortress she built to save her family might be the one thing that would cost her everything she had ever truly wanted. Welcome to Great Big Beautiful Life, a story about the family we're born into, the family we choose, and the devastating secrets that can bind them together or tear them apart. Before the storm, there was calm. Before the secrets, there was a story, a simple one, about a young woman named Alice Scott who believed in truth, in love, and in the power of a well-told tale. To understand the earthquake that was about to shatter her world, you must first understand the life she had so carefully built. You must feel the weight of what she had, what she was fighting for, so that when the ground begins to shake, you can feel, deep in your bones, just how much she stood to lose. Because it all began, as these things often do, with a story Alice thought she knew. Her life was written in punchy, fragmented sentences. Alice Scott, staff writer for The Scratch. A job she loved, a platform she respected. Her recent profile on the reclusive former child star Bella Girardi was the crown jewel of her career, a piece of writing so sharp and empathetic it had generated a full folder of laudatory screenshots and glowing emails. It was a victory, a concrete fact she could hold on to. Then there was Theo, on again, off again, not boyfriend. He was a comfortable mystery, a man whose easy confidence was as alluring as his inability to commit was frustrating. He existed in the margins of her life, a footnote of affection and ambiguity. These were the facts of Alice Scott's world, a world of professional pride and perfectly uncertainty, perfectly balanced on the knife's edge of ambition. And it was that professional pride, more than anything, that set the whole story in motion. The search for Margaret Ives began not with a grand conspiracy, but with a single, short email, a piece of digital flotsam that would change everything. The Bella Girardi profile had been a triumph, and in the flood of praise that followed, one message stood out. It was from a reader, a woman with the screen name Linda Takes Back Her Life at 53, and it contained a postscript that took root in Alice's mind like a stubborn weed. Did you know Margaret's living down on an island in Georgia now, selling art under a fake name? The idea was ludicrous. Margaret Ives, the tabloid princess, the rock and roll widow, vanished from the earth, rumored to be living with an Italian olive farmer, not selling trinkets on some backwater Georgia island. Yet the possibility became an obsession. Alice spent weeks trawling the strange, flickering rabbit holes of the internet, navigating the digital territories where forgotten stories festered. She waded through forums dedicated to Cosmo Sinclair's music, to the sprawling history of the Ives media empire, finding nothing. Then she found the conspiracy theorists, the digital detectives who traded grainy photos of Elvis at a Tuscaloosa mall and whispered about JFK in a bucket hat in Miami. And there, buried in a forum titled Not So Dead Celebrities, was the breadcrumb. A single post, a whisper that led her here, to Little Crescent Island, Georgia. Now, sitting in her rental car, the engine finally off, the reality of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. The dense midday heat of a Georgia summer wrapped around her like a living thing, carrying the scent of salt and sea and ancient, knowing trees. It was more than a location. It was a feeling, a sensation she hadn't realized she'd been missing for 11 years in Los Angeles. The sound of cicadas pulsed in the air, a high, electric hum. Every time she saw a Georgian live oak, a part of her still whispered, home. The air was thick with hope and a thrumming undercurrent of anxiety. She took a deep breath, the taste of the Atlantic on her tongue, and stepped out of the car. Her sandals slapped against the stone walkway as she followed its curve around a riot of foliage, black needle rush, cabbage palm, and the steadfast presence of the live oaks. Then she saw it. A charming turquoise house on wooden stilts, its front door a defiant, joyful hot pink, covered in hand-painted white swirls. It was a house that hummed with personality. She pressed the doorbell, and instead of a buzz, a sound like wind blowing through chimes echoed from within. It was perfect. The door swung open, and the fantasy wavered. A short, gray-haired woman in a faded flannel shirt and jeans scowled out at her, her eyes a pale, challenging blue. "Hi, I'm Alice, Scott," Alice said, her hand outstretched, her voice a little too bright. The woman just stared. "With the scratch?" Alice added, the words feeling flimsy and ridiculous in the thick, silent air. For a horrifying moment, Alice's mind spiraled. Was this all an elaborate hoax, a prank orchestrated by some basement-dwelling trickster, his voice pitched high to mimic an elderly woman on the phone? It wouldn't be the first time. She cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "I'm sorry, are you Margaret?" The woman barked a loud, genuine laugh that shattered the tension. "I'm Jody," she said, her voice carrying a faint, indeterminate accent. "Come on in." Alice stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house was a beautiful, cluttered sanctuary of art and books and plants. A thatched fan turned lazily overhead, its soft whir barely disturbing the warm air. But there was nothing to prove this was Margaret's home. No photos of the famous Ives family, no framed covers of their magazines, no Grammys belonging to her late husband, the legendary Cosmo Sinclair, resting on the mantel. Doubt began to creep back in, a cold shadow in the sunlit room. Jody stepped out a back door into a wild garden, promising to go grab Madame. Alice waited, her nerves vibrating, ready to demand answers. The door swung open again, and Alice spun around. And then she saw her. The woman was smaller than in the old photographs, her once jet-black hair now a soft mix of brown and silver. The glamour was gone, scrubbed away by time and intention, but the sly, knowing sparkle in her blue eyes was unmistakable. It was the same elusive magic that had turned a newspaper heiress into the princess of the cover page. It was Margaret Grace Ives. "Well, hello there." Margaret's voice was warm, just as it had been on the phone, a surprising kindness in the voice of a woman who had every reason to be bitter. "You must be Alice." "You're her," Alice managed to say, every eloquent sentence she had ever crafted deserting her. Margaret laughed, a rich, genuine sound. "I was under the impression that was the point." She was real, she was here, and for a breathtaking moment, Alice felt the story of a lifetime unfolding right in front of her. The joy was so potent, so overwhelming, that it made the blow that followed all the more devastating. The doorbell chimed again, that same whimsical sound of wind and glass. Margaret glanced at a driftwood clock on the mantel. "That'll be my 2 o'clock." Alice's heart sank. She hadn't realized this was an audition with multiple candidates. Margaret led her back to the front door, and as she swung the bright pink panel open, Alice Scott's world tilted on its axis. Standing on the top step was a hulking, dark-eyed, hawk-nosed man in slate-colored chinos and a crisp, white t-shirt. He was an intimidating presence, a physical manifestation of everything Alice was not. Hayden Anderson. Not just Hayden Anderson, the music journalist. Now, he was Hayden Anderson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, the man who had penned a doorstop-length masterpiece about an Americana singer that had made Alice weep openly in a taqueria. He was the more successful, more well-known, more branch that Margaret was about to shake from the tree. His dark eyes flickered from Alice, a blank, dismissive glance that confirmed he had no idea who she was, to Margaret, before his low, rumbling voice cut through the thick air. "Am I early?" "You're exactly on time," Margaret said warmly. Alice was just going. And in that single, crushing moment, the bottom dropped out of Alice's world. The joy curdled into a cold, sickening dread. A voice in her head, sharp and cruel, began listing all the reasons he was more qualified. He has a Pulitzer. You have nice press-on nails. He writes landmark biographies. You write celebrity profiles. He is an oak tree. You are a weed. The imposter syndrome she fought daily came crashing down, an avalanche of self-doubt. Her lifelong dream was no longer a solo pursuit. It was a competition, a fierce, brutal, and utterly terrifying competition against a man who looked like he had never lost at anything in his life. The air grew thick with a new, palpable tension, the quiet hum of a battle about to begin. There was a particular kind of strategic brilliance, a unique form of emotional cruelty in Margaret Ives's proposal. To call it a job interview would be to grossly underestimate its design. She wasn't merely looking for a writer, she was orchestrating a psychological stress test, a month-long trial by fire on a tiny, sweltering island where escape was not an option. It was a crucible, dear listener, designed to forge alliances, ignite rivalries, and strip away every carefully constructed facade until only the raw, authentic character of each participant remained. Margaret wasn't just auditioning a biographer, she was casting the final, most important role in her own story, and she would do it by watching how they behaved when the pressure was on, when their deepest desires were dangled just out of reach. The proposal came over dinner on Margaret's patio, under a canopy of globe lights that cast a warm, deceptive glow on the scene. The air pulsed with the sound of cicadas and crickets, a wild symphony for an unorthodox audition. Hayden sat across from Alice, a rigid, unreadable behemoth of a man, while Margaret, a martini in hand, laid out her terms. "A month," she said, her tone breezy, as if suggesting a weekend getaway. "I'll pay you both, of course, a reasonable housing stipend. You'll sign NDAs, and I'll meet with each of you throughout the month. At the end, you show me what you've got. I choose one of you to do the book with, and we go off and sell it to the highest bidder." Alice's mind raced. "Yes," a voice inside her screamed. "I'll do it. I'll do anything." She would have drained her savings, put her job at the scratch on the line, stood on her head and recited the alphabet backward if Margaret had asked. This was her Everest. Hayden, however, was less enthused. He listened with a frown etched deep into his brow, his questions sharp, bordering on combative. "And what if one of us just bows out?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of challenge. "So you're saying," he bit out a moment later, "that we could both put a month of work into this and you might not even decide to do the book?" He was pushing back, questioning the terms, while Alice was ready to sign her life away. Margaret met his gaze with a gleam in her eye, unbothered, even amused by his resistance. "That's the deal." Hayden's eyes flashed to Alice, a silent, loaded glance before he spoke two words that sealed their fate. "All right." It wasn't an agreement, it was a declaration of war. "All right, I'm in." Margaret turned her dazzling smile to Alice. "Miss Alice, what do you think?" "I'm in," Alice said, her voice full of a conviction that was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. "And if you're thinking this is just a story about two writers competing for a job, look closer. On this tiny, sweltering island, the real story wasn't the one being told into a recorder. It was the one unfolding between the lines, in the charged glances across a dinner table, in the silent negotiations of shared space, and in the slow, unwilling recognition of a rival as something more. The story was about the terrifying, magnetic pull of two people forced into an orbit they could neither control nor escape. The first hint of this inescapable proximity came as they were leaving Margaret's house, Tupperware containers of leftover lemon meringue pie in hand. "Where are you staying?" Margaret asked. "The Grande Lucia," Alice said. Hayden's eyes cut sideways toward hers, his mouth twisting down for a fraction of a second before he faced Margaret again. "Grande Lucia," he bit out, the words tasting like ash. "Oh, good," Margaret chirped. Glad he won't be far from a friend, if you need one." Later, under the pale moonlight in the resort's parking lot, the reality of their situation became starkly clear. They were not just competitors, they were neighbors. His room was directly adjacent to hers. The inescapable closeness of their new reality settled over them, heavy and suffocating. They stood on the walkway between their identical pale blue doors, negotiating the interview schedule like generals planning a campaign. "Monday, Wednesday, Friday," he grunted, the words clipped and impersonal. It was a power play, giving him the weekend days. Alice countered, and the negotiation became a tense, surprising dance. He pointed out that they both needed weekdays free for freelance work, that a full picture of a subject required a more complete view of her schedule. For a moment, Alice saw a flicker of something unexpected beneath his cold exterior: fairness. "So what, you're looking out for me?" she asked, her brow inching upward, "instead of just taking me upper hand?" He rolled his eyes, a dismissal that couldn't quite mask the truth. "Trust me," he called as he unlocked his door, a huge shadow against the night. "I don't need an upper hand." And with a final, dismissive grunt that might have been a laugh, he disappeared into his room, leaving Alice alone in the hallway, the shared wall between them seeming to hum with a strange, new energy. The audition had begun. There is an undeniable chemical reaction that occurs when ambition and proximity are forced into the same small vessel. On Little Crescent Island, the sterile laboratory of competition would soon become a pressure cooker, and the first cracks to appear would not be in their resolve, but in the very armor they wore to protect themselves from each other. For Alice Scott and Hayden Anderson, the Grande Lucia resort became their shared crucible, and the first fissures in Hayden's intimidating facade began to show not under the glare of Margaret's scrutiny, but in the quiet, unguarded moments between interviews. It started with small encounters, tiny fractures in the stone wall of his professional demeanor, revealing the man hidden beneath the Pulitzer Prize. The first night, fueled by Twizzlers and a potent mix of anxiety and determination, Alice fell down the rabbit hole of Googling Hayden Anderson. She devoured rave reviews of his book, winced at an article estimating its sales in the millions, and finally, just to torture herself, watched an interview where he leaned forward without a trace of irony and declared, "I'm very competitive." It was a confirmation of her deepest fears. The next night, seeking solace and a stiff drink, she found him at the Fishbowl, a kitschy local bar. He was hunched over a tiny table, an e-reader in his large hands, looking like a bear at a tea party. It was ridiculous to treat him like an enemy, she told herself. He was a guy who wrote a book she loved. Bolstered by a few sips of a gargantuan, violently blue cocktail called the Captain's Bowl, she approached him. The conversation was stilted, a clumsy dance of professional courtesy and barely concealed competition. He accused her of trying to professionally thwart him when she was just trying to be friendly. "Why are you smiling?" he asked dryly, his brow furrowed as she slid out of the booth. But underneath the sting of his accusation, a strange feeling took root in her chest. Hope. His competitiveness meant he saw her as a threat. He saw her. As a parting shot, a playful act of war, she sent an enormous, even bluer, Captain's Bowl to his table, a gesture meant to brighten his mood the way he had, surprisingly, brightened hers. The true fracture in his armor, however, came at 4 in the morning, heralded by the screech of a fire alarm and the strobe of flashing lights. The hotel parking lot was a scene of sleepy chaos, a symphony of a dozen different cell phone alarms going off as guests stumbled into the humid night. Alice, clutching her laptop and phone in a scratchy hotel blanket, found herself cornered by a swaying, red-eyed drunk man whose toothy grin blasted her with the smell of stale liquor and something acrid, like burnt popcorn. "Better now, baby," he slurred, his gaze dripping down her like slime as he latched onto her elbow. Panic began to prickle at the edges of her composure. "There you are," a low, cool voice said behind her. Hayden. He towered over them, his face a stony mask of authority. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He simply inserted himself into the situation, a calm, immovable object. With a few curt words, he diffused the encounter, steering Alice away from the drunk man and deeper into the parking lot. "Thank you," she said. "I'm really bad at that." He just tilted his head, a puzzling expression on his face. "I was serious," he said, surprising her. "About going to get breakfast, if you want to join." Ray's Diner, 25 minutes away on the mainland, was an oasis of fluorescent light and the rich, comforting smell of hot coffee in the pre-dawn darkness. Sitting across from him in his preferred corner booth, the most protected seat in the house, the walls between them began to crumble in earnest. Over peaches and cream French toast and egg whites, their pasts spilled out. He told her about growing up as the black sheep son of a small-town Indiana mayor, a life lived under a microscope of public expectation. "Unless I joined the Peace Corps," he said, a wry twist to his lips, "I was never going to live up to that." The irony was not lost on Alice. "That's pretty much a perfect segue," she cut in, "into the fact that my sister actually, literally, is in the Peace Corps." She then shared her own story, of her eccentric, idealistic parents, of being homeschooled, and of the long, terrifying shadow of her sister Audrey's childhood illness. She spoke of the constant worry, the sterile scent of hospitals, the fear that had shaped her optimistic, life-affirming worldview. He listened, his gaze intense, the hardness in his face softening into something gentler, something like understanding. For the first time, they were not just rivals. They were two people with complicated families and heavy burdens, finding a moment of unexpected connection in a 24-hour diner at the edge of the world. The air between them had changed, charged with a new, fragile intimacy. But how do you build trust with a man whose job it is to beat you? Margaret Ives was a master storyteller, but not in the way one might expect. She didn't begin her tale with the glamour or the tragedy of her own life. Instead, she began deep in the past, weaving a sprawling history of her ancestors, a narrative tapestry so rich and detailed it seemed designed to obscure as much as it revealed. It was a strategic misdirection, a fortress of lore built to protect a single, vulnerable truth. She presented her family's saga not as a confession, but as a grand, sweeping epic, casting herself as a mere curator of stories that were not her own. It was a brilliant defense mechanism, a way to control the narrative by controlling its very foundation. She started with Lawrence Richard Ives, her great-grandfather, a man she described as being born hungry. She painted a vivid picture of a boy from a destitute Pennsylvania farming family in the 1830s, one of 10 children who watched his siblings die and who was driven west not by greed, but by a desperate, all-consuming need to protect the family he had left. He was a man, Margaret explained, who was terrified of loss, a fear that fueled his relentless ambition. This hunger, she said, was the true source of the Ives family fortune and its curse. As Margaret spoke, her voice captivating, Alice found herself drawn into the tale. But a seed of suspicion had been planted. There was an ache in Margaret's voice as she told these stories, an emotional depth that felt too personal for a history she claimed to have learned from old family journals. She spoke as if she had lived it herself. The first thread of deception Alice pulled was small, almost insignificant. Margaret recounted the story of Lawrence buying his first hotel in a booming Nevada mining town. The Ebner, she said, the name seeming to stick in her throat. Alice scribbled it down, but later that night, in the quiet of her rented bungalow, a quick search revealed the lie. During Lawrence Ives's ownership, the hotel was called the Arledge. It was only after his death in 1919 that his son, Gerald, renamed it the Nicolette in honor of Lawrence's beloved sister. The hotel wasn't sold and renamed the Ebner until the 1970s, long after Margaret's one family visit there as a child. Why lie about something so trivial? The discrepancy wriggled in the back of Alice's mind, a tiny key, a lock she hadn't seen. With Margaret, she was learning, There were no meaningless mistakes. The central clue, the one that would eventually unlock the entire mystery, came disguised as another piece of ancestral lore. Margaret told the story of her grandfather, the media magnate Gerald Ives, and his long, passionate affair with a silent film star named Nina Gill. It was an open secret, a well-documented part of the family history. But then Margaret revealed a part of the story no one had ever heard. She spoke of a secret child, a daughter named Ruth, born of their affair. To avoid scandal, the baby was brought home and raised as Gerald's niece, the daughter of his sister, Gigi. It was a story of sacrifice and hidden love. And then, almost as an aside, Margaret mentioned Ruth's unofficial middle name, a name whispered only among close family, Nicolette. The sentences shortened, the fragments appeared. Alice's pen stilled. Nicolette, the name of the hotel. Nicolette, the name of Lawrence's sister. It was a pattern, a recurring motif in a story full of misdirection. Alice felt a jolt of recognition, the electric thrill of a detective connecting the dots, her heart beginning to race. This wasn't just a name. It was a signpost, a breadcrumb. It was the key, she felt with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that could unlock the door to the one secret Margaret Ives was most desperate to protect. For two people locked in a professional duel, there is no more dangerous territory than the border between rivalry and intimacy. It is a line drawn in sand, and for Alice and Hayden, the tide was coming in, threatening to wash away every rule they had set for themselves and pull them into a current neither could escape. Their rivalry was no longer a simple contest. It had become inextricably tangled with a powerful, unspoken, personal connection. Every interview, every piece of the story they uncovered, became another layer in their own unfolding narrative, blurring the lines between competitor and confidant into a beautiful, terrifying mess. The unspoken tension finally snapped on a hot, sticky night after dinner at the rum room. They walked along a dark, pine needle-dusted path, the air thick with humidity and the things they weren't saying. The energy crackled between them, a magnetic pull that felt both inevitable and reckless. He stopped, and the world seemed to stop with him. He leaned in, his mouth hovering just inches from hers, and for a heart-stopping second, Alice thought he was going to kiss her. Then, just as abruptly, he pulled back, his face hardening into a mask of resolve. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice stern. "I shouldn't have given you the wrong idea." Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Alice. "And what idea is that?" she managed to ask, her voice reedy. "That I was interested in something like this," he said evenly. "With you." The words were a physical blow. But then he delivered the justification, a statement so arrogant and yet so deeply revealing that it took her breath away. "I'm not going to hook up with someone," he said, his voice low and intense, "whose dream job I'm about to take from them." He already believed he had won. The thought was infuriating, but somewhere beneath the anger, a different feeling stirred. He was protecting himself, and perhaps her, from a complication he was not equipped to handle. The storm that hit the island later that week felt like a physical manifestation of the tempest brewing between them. Wind howled, a percussive roar against the plywood-covered windows of Alice's bungalow. Rain lashed down in sheets, a frantic drumming on the roof. The power went out, plunging her into a smothering darkness. The storm inside her was just as fierce, a swirling chaos of frustration, desire, and a deep, aching loneliness. Then came a frantic pounding at her door, a sound that cut through the gale. It was Hayden, soaked to the bone, his face a mask of raw terror. "I called you," he said, his voice ragged. "You didn't answer." He hadn't been able to reach her, and in the heart of the storm, his carefully constructed walls had crumbled. He had been afraid for her. In the flickering candlelight of her living room, their guards finally came down completely. The conversation was raw, stripped of all pretense. He confessed the source of his guardedness, the reason he was so terrified of missing the truth when someone pretended to be fine. He told her about his mother's severe depression, about the years she had hidden her pain behind a mask of perfection, and the near tragedy that shattered his family. He had seen the same forced brightness in Alice, the same determination to be okay, and it terrified him. He was afraid of missing the cracks in her armor, just as he had missed them in his mother's. His vulnerability was a key, unlocking something deep inside Alice. She saw him then, not as the Pulitzer-winning giant, but as a man haunted by the fear of failing the people he cared about. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an emotional weight that was heavier than the storm raging outside. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in the darkness. The kiss was not gentle or tentative. It was a raw, desperate collision, a release of all the pent-up tension, fear, and desire that had been simmering between them for weeks. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and salt and a profound, shared loneliness. They ended up on the couch, a tangle of limbs and urgent need, their bodies communicating what their words could not. The encounter was fierce, almost frantic, a desperate attempt to find solace and connection in the heart of the storm. They stopped just short of sex, the emotional stakes too high, the future too uncertain. He pulled back, his breath ragged, his forehead pressed against hers. His whispered words hung in the air between them, a devastating prophecy. "I think if I get this job," he said, his voice splintering with a pain that mirrored her own, "you're going to break my heart." At the very heart of the Ives family's sprawling, complicated history lies a story of two sisters. It is not a story of media empires or rock and roll royalty, but a quieter, more devastating tale of love, jealousy, and a profound, life-altering loss. The story of Margaret and Laura Ives is the curse and the blessing of their family, the wound that never truly healed, and the love that, in its own tragic way, defined them both. It was the story Margaret had been avoiding, the one that held the key to understanding everything that came after, and finally, she was ready to tell it. She began with A Perfect Night, the Cosmo Sinclair concert in 1958. She painted the scene with a wistful, aching nostalgia, her voice soft with the memory of it. She described the energy of the crowd at the Pan Pacific Auditorium, a tangible thing, a wave of anticipation and excitement that swept through the thousands of people packed onto the floor. She spoke of the thrill of sneaking her shy, reclusive sister, Laura, out of the gilded cage of the House of Ives for one night of freedom. For the first time in years, Laura's face was alight with a reckless, unadulterated joy. As Cosmo took the stage, a magnetic shadow in a black suit, Margaret watched her sister, not the star, and thought her heart might burst. For one perfect night, they were just two girls, screaming lyrics, passing a flask back and forth, and believing in the magic of a moment. The magic shattered in an instant. A swell in the crowd, a surge toward the stage, and the perfect night devolved into a chaotic brawl. Margaret lost Laura in the throng, a terrifying moment of panic and confusion. By the time security reunited them, the damage was done. Laura was bloodied and dazed, the joy extinguished from her eyes. As they were rushed from the venue, they learned the night's true tragedy. Their grandfather, Gerald Ives, had died while they were out dancing. The weight of it was crushing. Margaret felt with a sickening certainty that their one perfect night, their one act of rebellion, had somehow caused this devastation. The headlines that followed were brutal, painting them as callous socialites who partied while their patriarch lay dying. In the midst of this grief and guilt, Cosmo Sinclair reappeared. He arrived at the House of Ives with a bouquet of lily of the valley and a shy, sincere apology. What followed was a whirlwind romance, an elopement to Las Vegas, and a media frenzy that cast them as the nation's new royal couple. Margaret once again found herself playing a role for the cameras, but this time the love felt real. It was a dizzying, intoxicating period, but it was shadowed by Laura's retreat deeper into herself. Laura found a new guide in a controversial psychologist named Dr. David Atwood, the leader of a group called The People's Moment. What began as correspondence about psychological theories soon became something more sinister. Laura disappeared into Atwood's world, cutting off all contact with her family. Then came the letter. It was a demand for money, an extortion plot threatening to release Gerald Ives' secret journals if the family didn't pay. Margaret agreed to meet Laura at a grubby diner in Palm Springs. The woman she saw there was a ghost of her sister, emaciated, her eyes filled with a terrifying, vacant fear. In a hushed, desperate whisper, Laura revealed the truth. Atwood's group was not a spiritual movement. It was a cult, stockpiling illegal weapons for a planned political assassination. She gave Margaret an address, a date, a time. "He'll kill me if he knows," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. It was a profound act of betrayal and a desperate cry for help. The information led to a violent FBI raid on a warehouse, a shootout that left several people dead, and the arrest of David Atwood. The trial that followed was a media circus, and it was Laura's testimony that put Atwood behind bars. But the trauma of it all, the cult, the betrayal, the public scrutiny, left a deep, indelible scar on both sisters, shaping the rest of their lives in ways they could never have imagined. Every lie, every carefully constructed half-truth, every strategic misdirection in Margaret Ives' story had been a diversion, a breadcrumb trail leading away from the one, single, world-shattering secret she'd guarded for over half a century. It was the truth that had sent her into hiding, the truth that had fractured her relationship with her sister, and the truth that had brought two unsuspecting writers to a small Georgia island. Now, you might think you see where this is going. You have the name, you have the doctor. But the truth, as it so often is far more heartbreaking than the mystery. The final pieces of the puzzle began to click into place for Alice, not in an interview, but through a series of methodical, late-night investigations. The name Nicolette was the key. Hayden's offhand comment that it was his mother's name had been the spark, but the real breakthrough came from a grainy photograph, a man with a gap-toothed smile testifying at David Atwood's trial in the 1960s, Dr. Cecil Willoughby. Then a second discovery, the same gap-toothed smile, this time in a white coat, seen in a press conference video filmed outside the hospital after Cosmo Sinclair's death. It was the owner of the fishbowl, the man who threw himself a half-birthday party every summer, Captain Cecil. The coincidence was too immense, too statistically impossible to be an accident. The family doctor, present at two of the most traumatic events in the Ives sisters' lives, was now living under an assumed name on the same tiny island as a reclusive Margaret. A jolt of adrenaline, hot and sharp, coursed through Alice. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was on the precipice of the final, terrible truth. She arrived for her last scheduled interview with Margaret armed not just with her recorder, but with an accusation. She laid out the facts, connecting the dots between Cecil, the trial, and Cosmo's death. Margaret's composure, for the first time, shattered completely. The story she finally told was the one that had been buried beneath all the others. She recounted the car crash, the rush to the hospital, the agonizing news of Cosmo's death. And then she delivered the secret she had carried alone for so long. She had been secretly pregnant when the crash happened. The severe abdominal pain that had sent them racing to the hospital wasn't just appendicitis. It was a complication of her pregnancy. Cosmo had died without ever knowing he was going to be a father. In the depths of her grief, terrified of bringing a child into a world that had just stolen its father and would surely devour the baby with the same relentless media scrutiny, she made a devastating choice. With Cecil Willoughby's help, she gave the baby up for a closed adoption. A daughter. A daughter she named Nicolette. The rest of the ruse unraveled with a terrible, heartbreaking clarity. The book was never real. It was a pretext, an elaborate fiction designed to bring her grandson, Hayden Anderson, to the island without revealing her identity. She had read his book, seen the empathy and kindness in his writing, and had concocted the scheme as the only way she could imagine to meet the family she had given away. Alice's role in the charade had been that of a buffer, a plausible reason for a reclusive heiress to be interviewing biographers. Margaret's confession was a torrent of desperation, guilt, and a deep, profound fear of rejection. "He doesn't want anything from me," she pleaded. "Please, don't tell him." She offered Alice the book deal, the dream job, everything she had ever wanted in exchange for her silence. It was a devastating choice. To accept would be to become complicit in a lie that was tearing a family apart. To refuse would be to walk away from her dream and, even more painfully, from the man she had fallen in love with. Alice looked at the small, broken woman in front of her, a woman trapped in a fortress of her own making, and made her choice. She stood up, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, and walked away. The truth, once unearthed, carries a cost. It is a currency of its own, and how you choose to spend it defines who you are. For Alice Scott, the story was no longer about winning a job or writing a biography. It was about the devastating weight of a secret that was not hers to keep, a truth that could either heal a fractured family or shatter a nascent, fragile love. The final chapter was not about Margaret Ives' past, but about Alice's future and the kind of world she was willing to build for herself. The final conversation with Hayden was gut-wrenching. He found her at her bungalow, a bottle of champagne in hand, ready to celebrate what he assumed would be her victory. She had to tell him she wasn't taking the job, that she was walking away from her dream, and she couldn't explain why. "You're lying to me, Alice," he said, the hurt in his voice a physical blow. "What's going on?" She could only shake her head, the secret a gag in her throat, and watch as he walked away, the distance between them feeling vast and insurmountable. The pain of the decision was acute, a sharp, clean break that left her feeling hollowed out and utterly alone. She retreated to her mother's house, a quiet, overgrown sanctuary in the Georgia countryside. In the familiar shared work of the garden, digging her hands into the rich soil, a different kind of truth began to surface. She and her mother, Angela, had a long, difficult conversation, one that had been waiting decades to happen. Alice finally confronted the hurt she had carried for years, the feeling of being unseen, of her life and her work being disrespected. And her mother, in turn, shared her own story of fear and inadequacy, of the struggle to parent a daughter she loved but didn't always understand, especially after the death of the one person who did. In that shared vulnerability, a new understanding bloomed between them. The old, painful knots of their relationship began to loosen, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. It was a critical moment of healing, a quiet mending of a bond she hadn't realized was so broken. A week later, Hayden appeared in the driveway. He was holding a letter, its pages filled with her familiar handwriting. It was the letter she had written to Margaret, the one she had mailed before leaving the island. In it, she had told Margaret everything she couldn't say to Hayden's face. He read a line aloud, his voice rough with emotion. "He's careful about his health. He doesn't have a complete family medical history to rely on, so he tries not to take risks." He looked up, his eyes fixed on hers. "Is it true," he asked, "that you love me?" The tears broke then, a release of all the pain and fear she had been holding. "Of course it's true," she whispered. "Good," he said, his voice cracking, "because I love you too." He told her he would move, that he would follow her to Los Angeles, but she stopped him. She was staying, here in Georgia, close to her mom, ready to write a new story. He didn't hesitate. "Then I'm moving to Georgia," he said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious decision in the world. And in the golden light of a Georgia sunset, he pulled her into his arms, their reunion a quiet, powerful promise of a new beginning. The world they built together was quiet and slow and beautiful. They co-authored Margaret's biography, finding a way to tell her story truthfully, carefully protecting the one secret that mattered most. The book was a love story, a tribute to the family she had lost and the one she was cautiously, tentatively, beginning to find. Hayden and his mother, Nicolette, began the slow, delicate process of building a relationship with Margaret. Their weekly visits to the turquoise house on Little Crescent Island marked by a quiet, hopeful grace. Alice and Hayden built their own life, their love story unfolding not in dramatic headlines, but in the small, everyday moments of shared work and easy companionship. Their own home was filled with the scent of coffee and almond soap, with the sound of two keyboards clicking in tandem, with a love that felt as steady and as rooted as the ancient live oaks that surrounded them. 1 year later, Alice sat in that home, a blank document open on her computer screen, a new story waiting to be told. She looked down at the tiny, sleeping baby in her arms, a daughter with her father's dark eyes and a spirit all her own. She thought of the long, winding path that had led her here, of the broken pieces and painful truths that had, against all odds, been rearranged into something beautiful. She cracked her knuckles, took a deep breath, and began to write, welcoming her daughter Laura to this great, big, beautiful life.